My name is Kate McIver, and I am your host for this Learning Lab with Paula, Chief Research Officer at NOBL Collective, on the missing middle, how to spread innovation to the rest of the organization. When innovative ideas repeatedly hit a dead end within an organization, leaders often ask themselves, how do we get more people engaged in innovation? But maybe that's the wrong question. In this interactive section, Paula will discuss how to bridge that critical gap between invention and industry standard, exploration and optimization. You'll come away with a better understanding of why the why of innovation matters, the different skill sets required to innovate and scale, and new tools and frameworks to get better buy-in. And before I hand over the mic, I want to make sure you know how to engage with Paula, as we do want this session to address your actual issues. Best if you turn on your camera so that we can all see each other. Then we'll all use the chat to engage and ask your questions. So you can also raise your hand in the Zoom tool if you'd like to be on mic and ask your question directly. And so let's get started. I'll hand it over to Paula. And if you can go into the chat, type in your name, where you're from, and what your main question is for this session. So Paula, over to you.
All right. Hello, everybody. Just checking, you can see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So wanted to say hi to everybody. Thank you so much for joining me on this Tuesday afternoon. Of course, Tuesday, it's a relative term, especially in an age of COVID. Everybody, it just sort of feels like today. Really excited to talk to you about spreading innovation to the rest of the organization. So why don't we just go ahead and get started? So in September of 1942, the Allied powers were racing to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany. And as part of this massive effort to win, they actually ended up building a secret city where there were well over 75,000 people employed, and they spent $2 billion, that's in 1940s dollars, $2 billion on what was ultimately a scientific bet that they could harness the power of fission. Now, to provide the raw materials for the bomb, the United States government had purchased at $1.60 a pound, 2.4 million pounds of high-quality uranium that originated in a mine in the Belgian Congo, which is what you see here. The owner, who was Belgian, had wisely exported the uranium when the Axis powers started eyeing Africa. They had seen the writing on the wall, and they'd actually shipped it to warehouses in Staten Island. So the United States government already had access to it. Now, the problem with uranium, even the high quality stuff, no matter where it comes from, is that it actually comes in two isotopes, 235 and 238. So if you don't remember your high school chemistry, that's okay. What it just means is that one essentially has more neutrons than the other, and it is therefore heavier, right? 238 is heavier. If you're building a bomb, what you want is uranium-235. It is more fissionable. That is, it's easier to split, so you can get to its energy easier. The problem is it is also rarer. Out of 1,000 pounds of uranium, only 7 is going to be 235. And of course, we're talking about things at an atomic level, right? This isn't something you could just separate by hand or eyeball it. You have to come up with a system for being able to separate these at literally an atomic level. And if you're a part of the Manhattan Project in particular, you realize it's not just that you need uranium-235, it's that you need 3 times what you had originally estimated of uranium in order to test and build this bomb. As it turned out, just one of the bombs, little boy, needed 141 pounds of uranium-235 alone. So remember, for every 1,000 pounds of uranium, you only get 7 of the things, only 7 of the pounds that you actually need in order to build a bomb. And again, this is for all of the marbles, right? If Nazi Germany gets to the bomb first, all of your work is for nothing. So in February 1943, in order to produce sufficient quantities of this enriched uranium, of this U-235, they decided to build a secret city, and it was called Site X. Now, Site X or as it was also known, Clinton Engineering Works, was located in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, although officially, of course, Oak Ridge didn't exist. For a non-existent place, it was absolutely enormous. It was 17 miles long and 7 miles wide, and it had 3 plants which were dedicated solely to enriching uranium. Now, of course, if you have a plant of this size, you're going to need the people to run it. But it's the middle of the war and help is hard to find, right? 16 million young men were fighting overseas, and the men and women who remained in the country were usually involved in the war effort in some way, shape, or form. They were in manufacturing. So it was really hard to find people who were able to operate this machinery and these plants. To make it more complicated, because this project was so secretive, it was also really hard to recruit people. Potential hires didn't know where they were going or for how long or really what their job would entail exactly, right? So usually when we recruit people, we are able to tell them what it is they're going to be doing and be able to really sell them on that. The only thing that the recruiters could use in this instance was the fact that their jobs, the people who worked at this mysterious site, might actually make a speedy victory possible, right? They might end the war even sooner. So I want you to keep that idea in mind because we're going to come back to it a little bit later. So not only was there a question of where we were going to find all these people, right? There was also a question of skill. So at Berkeley, where they had initially been conducting these small scale experiments to enrich uranium, the only people who were allowed to operate this equipment was, not surprisingly, PhDs, right? They were the ones who ran the electromagnetic separation units that would separate 235 from 238. And what you see here is actually a picture of one of these electromagnetic separators. It's in the RAD lab, the radiation lab at Berkeley. Now, obviously what you see here doesn't really scale, right? You need to build a massive operation in order to be able to produce enough uranium to create your bomb. So after discussing it, what they decided to do was they would designate this PhD team as essentially the builders, right? Like they would actually create the control cubicles that operators would use in order to actually process all of this material. They would bring in additional operators who would do the day-to-day work. So what they actually did to find those operators was recruiters went out to large rural communities and they hired young women who were just out of high school. Many of them were still in their teens. And when I say rural, I do mean rural. We're talking about people who came from homes that often didn't have plumbing, they didn't have electricity, right? We're talking public schools with not a lot of education. You would often see them referred to as hillbillies if you look at the historic material. So I want you to imagine that you are one of these young women. You're from a rural area in backwoods America, and you're told to take a train to Knoxville, Tennessee for an incredibly important cause that could change the course of the war, but you don't know what it is or how you're going to change it. So a cart picks you up from the station and drops you off at Site X, which is still under construction, and it is covered in mud. There's so much mud that when you step out of the car, your new shoes actually sink in, and you have to walk barefoot to your dormitory. After a few weeks of training, you are sat in a cubicle, essentially in front of this wall of panels. You have a range of gauges and knobs in front of you. Your job is to keep these gauges and needles within a certain range. And every so often, a supervisor comes by to empty out a little box of whatever it is you're making. Some people think that it might be for film. It might be film related because Tennessee Eastman was one of the contractors. Other people would like to joke that it was that they were making the drab green paint that covered all of the plants, all the construction in the area. You don't know. You have no idea what it is that you are actually creating, and you don't need to know. Curiosity is not encouraged. Don't ask questions. So at some point, one of the lead engineers at these plants made a really interesting observation. When it came to producing uranium on a per run basis, those young women, those hillbillies, were actually outproducing the team of PhDs and scientists from Berkeley. And what you see here is what I showed you from the Rad Lab, right? It's a much larger, huge enterprise, again, solely dedicated to enriching uranium. So what they decided to do, the engineers agreed to a race. Whoever's team produced the most enriched uranium in a set period would win. And I want to be clear, there was no official prize, there was no trophy. The prize was bragging rights. And to be honest, the young women probably didn't even know that they were in a contest. Again, you weren't encouraged to talk. This was not an opportunity to share. This was not a team building activity, if you will. So after doing this contest for a set period of time, the PhDs lost, hands down, no question. The people who had trained for years, who understood what was actually going on at the plant, who had actually built the system, they lost to a bunch of hillbillies who, in many cases, they didn't even know what knobs and gauges were a few weeks ago. Again, in training, they actually had to learn that sometimes knobs could be twisted left and right. Like that's literally the level of technical know-how that many of these operators came in with. But it gets really interesting when you look at exactly why these fairly uneducated, compared to the PhDs, operators were able to so outperform the PhD team. And the reason is that the PhD team were tinkerers, right? They would start the process fully intending to get the most uranium out of the process as possible, but they would inevitably get distracted. They would start trying things to make the tanks run faster, more effectively, harder, better, stronger, right? Whereas the young women didn't ask questions. They just did what they were told. They kept the needles and the gauges within the range that was acceptable, and were able to outperform. Again, hands down, there was no question who was better. Now, I want to make it really clear that one team isn't necessarily better than the other, right? Like, you need both those PhDs and tinkerers who can create the systems and the operators to operate those systems to succeed. But I think it's really important to call out that you shouldn't expect or demand that those operators act like tinkerers and vice versa, quite frankly. So as innovators, we're all innovators here, though maybe not at quite the level of a nuclear physicist. I will speak for myself at any rate. I think we're really naturally attracted to and excited by new possibilities, right? For us, it's really obvious that the organization needs to develop new opportunities to stay competitive, to stay ahead of our competitors, to continue to excite and delight our customers. As a general rule, we're more comfortable with failure. We like getting out of our comfort zones. Chances are you're always checking up on the newest trends. You're always looking for what's new, what's exciting, what could I be doing differently. So of course, we want other people to get excited by innovation, right? We're excited. We want others to be able to participate in that exploration and that discovery process. When I work with clients as the chief research officer of NOBL, that is typically the biggest question we get, right, from these innovation leaders. How do I get more people engaged in innovation? How do I reach those who are in the middle, who are waiting, as opposed to having them sit back and be reactive, right? Well, I would actually argue that maybe we need to question that premise. Maybe we need to ask ourselves if we really need people to, quote unquote, engage in innovation. Right now, there is a constant battle within organizations to become more innovative. And at the same time, the innovation team is asked to focus more on the day-to-day realities of the business, right? This tug of war isn't just exhausting, it's also missing the point. Let's think a little bit about the roles at play in this scenario and who should fill them before asking operators to think like innovators and vice versa. When you break down the work required to imagine new possibilities, develop them, and bring them to market, you'll actually discover that we are talking about 3 roles, not 2. what happens is that you feel the pain of that missing third role every time that there is a failed handoff. So as this audience is going to be well aware, right, the innovation team is dedicated to exploration, to finding new opportunities based on technology, consumer trends, business models, what have you. A lot of times this group is physically separate so that they can work unhampered by the demands of the organization or, dare I say, meddlesome executives. You haven't heard a lot about this particular team in this story of Site X because they were, in fact, at another location. They were largely located at the University of Chicago and Site Y, or Los Alamos, where the bombs themselves were being developed and where the, I would say, pure science, right, of atomic energy was being worked on. Now, these best innovators, they have a distinct skill set. They are really excellent at identifying new opportunities afforded by, like I said, technology, consumer trends, new business models. They are practiced at experimenting and creating prototypes. These are all very critical skills if you're going to be developing something new, but they are not necessarily the right ones for interacting with the organization at large. And at some point, you are going to have to interact with the rest of the organization, whether that is because you need resources or because you need them to implement your innovations, right? You need them to actually bring what you're doing to the masses. Now, at Site X at Clinton Engineering Works, the operators for the organization, they were the ones responsible for optimization, for executing on a process en masse, right? And creating as much enriched uranium as possible. So this is generally going to represent the largest subset of your employees. And not surprisingly, it's going to account for between 70 to, let's say, 90% of your budget. Their job is to deliver continuous improvement to your existing products and services based on qualitative and quantitative feedback from customers. So it's really important to note that when I say customer here, I'm not just talking about the person who buys it, who goes out to the store and completes a transaction. When I say customer, I mean anyone who consumes your output. So in the case of the operators, their customers were the supervisors and the assaying team that determined the quality of the enriched uranium. And the quantitative feedback that they were getting were the readings on the dials and the gauges. You keep your levels in a certain range. If you keep that needle from going too far to the left or right, you'll get better results. You'll get more stuff in that box, whatever that stuff is. Once you've established a basic level of training with these employees, you really just want them to perform. And finally, you have the team which is so often missing within organizations, and this is the scaling team. These were the PhDs who built the cubicles and were constantly tinkering, guiding the work of operators and improving the processes. They are really critical because they bridge this gap between invention and industry standard, right? These are your entrepreneurs, your political power players. You can also make an argument that they must be the most resilient because they have to overcome both consumer adoption and internal inertia, right? They have to get people used to and adopting change. In order to do that, they have to be able to paint a vision, again, externally and internally. They typically have to develop a revenue model and focus on adoption. So they're the ones who are able to take nuclear physics and build machines that a high school graduate could operate and update standard operating procedures with a better methodology. I think it's really important to call out that this is a unique skill set and it is not typically found in innovation teams. I think a lot of innovation team leaders think that, oh, well, like I can do both, right? My team can both innovate and scale. And for some organizations, that's true. That is absolutely possible and feasible, but not always. It is, like I said, it comes back to a different skill set. The people who are really good at things like product development, sense making, reaching out to the customer, are not necessarily the same people who are good at negotiation, persuasion, collaboration, playing politics, right? They may not even have an interest in doing these things. So I would really encourage you as an innovation leader to think about, do I have these skills on my team? Does this need to lie within my team? Are there people within the organization who are already doing this, who are already performing these sort of actions, and they just aren't necessarily organized? It's sort of done as a one-off situation. If you really want your ideas to scale within an organization, you are going to have to find or build these resources within your organization. It is really critical. These roles, again, they are essential. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm also not saying that there's no overlap, but they are distinct. So instead of demanding that we act like each other, that people engage with innovation, I would really encourage everyone to think about how important it is to know what your role is. And if you want people to get involved, if you want people to support your innovation efforts, then really focus instead on having a shared sense of mission. So at SiteX, at this Clinton Engineering Works, individuals were intentionally siloed, right? They would have badges that only allowed them into separate areas. They were not encouraged to have conversations about what they were doing at work or even with their spouses. They used different code names in different parts of the buildings in order to distinguish what they were talking about, right? For the different, essentially, types of uranium, for the different tools that they were using. But it was really important that they stayed separate. When they actually put the bomb together, it came from 3 different locations because they didn't want any one team to really know what was happening to prevent this from leaking to the Germans, to the Soviets, etc. Obviously, we are not encouraging this in your organizations today. We would encourage people to talk. We would encourage people to share information. I have, in fact, worked in organizations where people were told specifically, don't share it. That was bad. We worked to break down those walls so that there was greater encouragement, greater learning across the organization. But at the same time, there is a limit to the amount of information that any one individual can consume. And ultimately, you have to really think about the larger purpose here, which is like, what am I trying to achieve by sharing this knowledge? When you look back at the operators, it really didn't matter that they didn't know what they were producing because the purpose was clear, right? They were told, if you come and you help us with this process, there's a chance that we can end this war sooner. And that was something that everybody could buy into. Everybody appreciated that on an individual level because they had brothers, sons, boyfriends, neighbors who were over there. Their families back home were rationing and they were buying war bonds and they were raising victory gardens. So everyone quite literally had a dog in this fight, right? Everybody had something to gain by working towards a common goal, even if they didn't necessarily understand how their role played a part in this bigger picture. So if you're finding yourself really frustrated because people aren't engaging, I would ask you to step back and really ask yourself a couple of questions. The first is, am I the right person for this role, right? Maybe your strengths lie in finding new areas to explore rather than persuading others. That's okay. If that's the case, then you should probably get training on persuasion, maybe enlist other people in your company who are better suited. Remember, ultimately, you want to be thinking of that end goal of a scale team. Who are the strongest entrepreneurs? Who does have those political connections that you need in order to move your work forward so that you can actually focus on whatever it is that you do best as an innovator? The second thing that I would encourage you to think about is, what do I really need from people, right? Do you need everybody to engage? What does engagement actually look like? Does it just mean you want everybody to be excited about innovation? Is innovation a shiny object? Is it there to inspire people and to have them start thinking about new things? Or do you really just need to be left alone, right? Like, you really just want to be left alone so that you can come up with great ideas, which then get integrated into the organization, and you really just need resources from them, and you just need to convince somebody to write a check. That's also a perfectly valid option. I would really think about what exactly it is you mean by engagement and what you need from other people within the organization. The next thing I would do is think about what's the smallest change you can make to their existing routine. Look, everybody is busy. No one these days is sitting around kicking back. Everybody thinks what they're doing is a priority within the organization. I can pretty much guarantee you that anyone you talk to, any division that you're going to talk to your organization, they're going to think that what they're working on is a priority, right? HR absolutely thinks that D&I should be a bigger priority and everybody should be working on it. Operations absolutely thinks nothing is more important than production, because if there aren't products or services to buy, then the rest is sort of a moot point, right? Marketing right now thinks that the long-term brand value is the number one priority. And if we make cuts, we're going to be damaging ourselves in the long term, so we really need to be focused on that. People are already working on what they think is important or adds value. So if you want them to cooperate, if you want them to, again, engage with you on innovation, make it small. Maybe it is a new item on the checklist, right? Maybe it is specifying the right range, right? Adjusting the range of the needles. Maybe it is a different lens for considering one of their biggest recurring problems, right? Figure out what it is that they are already doing and see if there's small modifications that you can make there, as opposed to trying to introduce a massive new campaign or a major new initiative on top of what they're already doing. Because that's the other thing to consider, right? Typically what happens in organizations is not that, oh, a new priority comes in, we can drop something else. We don't have to do this anymore. A lot of times it is going to be a priority on top of their day job, on top of what they're already doing. And then the last thing that I want you to consider is, how is it going to get them what they want, right? You can't make people want what you want. You can't make them want something they don't want. That's just not how people work. So instead, you're going to have to look for a win-win solution. How is what you're doing, how is your priority actually going to help them? How is it going to move the organization closer towards its goals? Again, looking back at the purpose, at the objective of Site X, the entire point there was, if you do this, we will win the war earlier. And everybody wanted that to happen. So really think about what is it that I want that they also want, and how we can work together in order to make that happen. So what I wanted to do now is, we have a little bit of time. Just wanted to give everybody, let's say, 5 minutes to break into groups and actually discuss this in breakout groups, right? You don't have to answer all of them necessarily. Maybe just pick one or two that really speaks to you. Maybe it's, looking for people within your organization. Maybe it's talking about the small change that you think you can introduce to your team. But just wanted to give everybody a little bit of a chance to digest this material and have that conversation. So, Kate, can I turn it back over to you?
Yeah, and I think we have about 9 here, or I think people may not want to do total breakouts. I've seen a couple. So maybe we have an open conversation. I think maybe that might be a little bit better if someone wants to volunteer to maybe get us started and say, maybe answer the first one.
Yeah.
And we can have an intimate conversation with you. I think that might actually go a little bit better.
Great. The only warning that I will give people is that if everybody just sort of sits around and stares at the screen, I will volunteer you to answer one of the questions. So you have been warned. So yeah, I just open conversation then about, am I the right person for this role, right? Like, have you found that there are individuals within your group that tend to excel? Do you find your group has strengths in another area? What have you seen within your organization? Uh-oh.
I'll go first.
All right.
Yeah, and one of my questions for you is whether you have ways to really understand how people are wired. So my reality, at least I perceive my reality, is I have a small team that comes and goes because they have other day jobs. They seem to like to generate, so we create software and process-based services. So we're not shrink wrap products. We help healthcare do their work better. And my team tends to spitball ideas like at the very front end of that innovation invention, and then they don't want to do anything else, like none of it. And so I need to figure out, are they wired and capable and interested? So like, what might be that little change? I love that question. What might be that little change I could make in their life to get them to do a little bit more, which is what I really need from them.
So I think that's a really great point, right? And it gets back to this whole idea of you do need that middle team, because in my experience working with everyone from like rapidly scaling startups to Fortune 500s, like there's actually not usually a problem with coming up with new ideas. Like people are really inventive. People feel pain all the time, right? Like they see problems with the organization and everybody's like, oh, we can do this, we can do that, right? You come up with all of these solutions and then you're like, well, wait a minute, where do we start, right? Or you come up with a solution and you're like, well, how do I start to spread that to the rest? So I would say in some ways you've already sort of answered part of the question, which is like, well, how do I determine if they're wired? Like they're not, right? Like you're already saying that you've tried to get them to do it and they don't, right?
Right.
So I would be looking by hook or by crook, right? You might have to do a little bit of swapping. So I would be looking within the organization, are there people that do seem to have a lot of connections, are well known as political players, right? That really kind of like the wheeling and dealing and, backroom deals, if you will. I don't want this to sound shady, right? Like this is a part of business. But I would say, like, are there individuals that you can sort of recruit to be that separate team who does already have that skill set?
Okay. I
am a firm believer both in a growth mindset. I do think people can, of course, learn new skills, but also maybe don't, like, if you have people who do already have those skill sets, like go find them, recruit them, say like, hey, I flatter them. I know you're really good at this, right? Like, we'd love to have someone with your skills on our team.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, sounds
anybody
much
else?
More.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. No, I just wanted to say, like, anybody else want to chime in on that? Like, have you found something that works really well? Like, your team just isn't doing that extra thing that you've wanted. Is there any like trick or is there any tactic that you've tried in order to get people to expand?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Jordan.
Oh.
I'm corporate innovator in telco company in Senegal, in Western Africa. Thank you for your great presentation tonight. I'm very, very appreciate that. So I have main question tonight. How to engage, how to involve all employees in innovation projects. How to create the real connection between innovation units and classical business units.
So I think the first question there is, what is the connection, right? Because if your innovations are not ultimately driving the bottom line of the organization, chances are people aren't going to care. They are not going to invest. They don't want to spend their resources. Again, like everybody's fighting for these priorities. So I think the first thing that you need to do is to be able to demonstrate clearly, this is why we're going after it. This is how it's going to ultimately impact the bottom line. I would really be thinking about metrics and being careful about the metrics that you use, because the organization as a whole is typically going to be looking at financial metrics, such as like, how much did you make? How much did you spend, right? Like that's ultimately what it comes down to when you're an organization. When you are in an innovation team, you aren't going to be able to show that, because you don't know how much you're going to be able to make, especially if you are looking at something which is very new and hasn't been tried before. You may not know how much you're going to spend on this, because nobody knows actually how much they're going to spend. Humans are terrible at estimating. People always think like, oh, I can probably do this in an hour for $50, right? It doesn't work. Again, the literal nuclear physicists who built an atom bomb underestimated by 3 times the materials that they would need to build this bomb, right? So even nuclear physicists don't necessarily know how to estimate materials. So I would be looking at things like metrics like, what did we learn? How many things did we try, right? So that you can demonstrate that you are contributing to the organization, not necessarily in the financial areas that they would expect, but if you can demonstrate like, hey, we learned this new project, and as a result, we did not go into this particular field, right? So that was a cost savings, right? We learned and we were able to cut our losses a lot faster. Then that's something that which really demonstrates value to the organization. Again, it really comes back to that question of purpose, of goals. What is it that we are trying to achieve? And how does what I'm doing help you get there? Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Good. Many thanks.
Yeah.
Many thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Any other outstanding questions which people have? Maybe we just dive into those.
Don't be shy. You can unmute yourself. Just ask away.
Hey, I've got a question. I've just, hi, I'm Emma from Australia. This is my first session.
Welcome.
It's very early here. Thinking about just innovation, I've recently just joined an engineering company, and I feel like we've got an innovation team. That there's tension between having a separate innovation team in our organisation and a bunch of other people thinking that they know innovation and that innovation happens everywhere, which is true. It does. So I find even just, this has been a great presentation, but just even getting people on the same page about what innovation is a big thing. And getting back to what Janine was saying about how her innovation team just loved doing that really first bit about coming up with the ideas. Well, for some people, that's what they think innovation is. And then other people think it's the whole, getting back to a diagram, more to that whole getting up to the scale stage and implementing it so that it's business as usual. So there's all different types of interpretations. So my question is, I guess, how do you deal with that when people have very different ideas about what innovation is? Because it's such a meaningless word when it's so overused.
It's really funny you say this. I have literally heard this question at so many different types of organizations. Like I've worked with luxury goods, which is pretty far from an engineering team, and yet exactly the same question of like, what is innovation? Like everybody has their own interpretation of what it means. So we would typically say, first of all, let's actually look at, there's basically 3 types of innovation, or if you want, it's innovation, but just on a scale of disruption, however you want to slice it, right? So yeah, there's absolutely innovation, which is the optimization, which is the continuous improvement, right? Those are what you would see at an organization level. That's where you would expect to see everybody innovating. Absolutely, everybody can figure out a way to make their existing process better. Absolutely, everybody can figure out like, hey, this doesn't seem to be working. Let's try and find a different way, right? That's optimization, right? That's one type of innovation. Then you would have, I would say, expansion. You can call it exploration. The next level up would basically be identifying new opportunities, new windows for your existing products and services, right? So taking something that you were already doing and applying it in a new situation, right? That's your next level up of innovation. Diffusion is what we call it, right? Taking something you already have, trying it somewhere else. And then you have disruption, which is something to, right, that's coming up with something totally new that hasn't been seen before in really any circumstance, right? So that's coming up with new business models, that's coming up with typically a technological innovation, right? Like there's some new scientific technological advance which allows you to do things which you weren't able to before. That typically not everybody can do. To do that innovation, you actually usually need to be really an expert in what your field is to be able to understand, okay, this is something that is new and different and hasn't been tried before. That type of innovation often is a threat to the organization as a whole because it is going to cannibalize your existing efforts, right? Like it might actually like replace your industry. It's going to cut into your existing profits. So in some ways, that type of innovation is a real threat, and you're going to see the most resistance. That is why that type of innovation, this disruption, is often a separate corner. It is a lab. It is protected because the rest of the organization, just sort of by its nature, is going to kill it. Because looking again at those financial metrics that organizations live or die by, it's gonna harm those metrics in the short term. In the long term, it might be great. But in the short term, it's sort of antithetical to what the organization is trying to achieve. So I would say the first thing is to really think about, like, look, there's different types of innovation. Absolutely. Everybody should always be looking to improve what it is they do, 100%. But sometimes if there is a specific problem or if there's a specific technological opportunity, for example, then you really need experts who are going to be dedicated to that and focus on that. So that's the overlying question of innovation. I think there is an underlying question there, which actually has nothing to do with innovation per se, but is actually about trust, right? We see this all the time where different teams within an organization, like they say, like, oh, we need to get everybody, like we need to all align on what our purpose is and what our goals are. And a lot of times those teams will actually have different objectives and goals and different cultures. And you don't necessarily need them all to agree. You do need them to trust each other. You do need the people in these different teams to believe that the other teams have my back, right? Like they're not actively trying to shut me down. They are not actively trying to sabotage the work that I am doing. So that is a whole different topic. I don't necessarily have time to get into it right now. I'm happy to chat with you about it separately. But I do think there's an important discussion around building psychological safety with those teams, having individuals on those different teams believe that even though this person has a totally different style of work and totally different objectives, those objectives are going to be yes and, right? Like they care about making money, and they also care about sustainability, and they're not going to undercut my work in sustainability in order to make money, right? Or this team is really focused on the customer experience, but that doesn't mean that they are going to, again, give away the farm. They're going to support the work that I'm doing. They're going to report back so that we're in sync. And that comes down to a lot of communication. It comes down to taking small risks. Essentially, to build trust, it's like tennis in a way. Somebody takes a risk, and then they're met with trust. Essentially, people respond to that, and they're like, "Oh, okay, that was safe for me to do." And then the other person takes a little bit of a risk, and they're supported, and they're like, "Okay, that was safe for me to do." And through that process, it takes time. People start to understand, like, okay, we are actually all on the same page. We're not going to be at odds with each other. Long answer, but yes, innovation is a fuzzy word. There's 3 different types of it, depending on essentially how new or how out there it is. Ultimately, though, you need everybody on the team to have a level of trust and understanding between those teams so that you can all reach the same goal.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, happy to discuss. Anybody else have questions or wants to build on what we've been talking? I want to make sure it's not just me talking at you. This is a trick that I actually learned from a client. When they're on a call and there's a pause, they say, okay, I'm going to take 7 deep breaths. And that way they actually like give people time to think about, to consider what it is that they're doing. I think it's really important, especially on Zoom calls, because dead air seems like an eternity, but it's not. So I'm taking another 3 deep breaths in case you have any questions or want to build.
We have one question on the chat.
Oh, let me see if I can pull that up. Or actually, Kate, would you mind reading that out? I have many windows open.
Yes. How do you manage an innovation culture for the different types of innovation, or the 3 moments: innovate, scale, and optimize?
So I don't know if I would actually say that you manage them differently per se. It depends on how you define manage, right? I think ultimately as a manager, your role is to support the people who are doing the work. And so what is it that they need? How do they need to develop? What blockers or obstacles can you remove so that they can do their work? I think that's probably true whether you're talking about different types of innovation teams, whether you're talking about operations, right? Anyone within the organization, that is best practice for management. If you wanted to get a little bit more specific, then I think I can imagine that there would be like specific skills, right? Or a specific training that you would expect to see, certainly different metrics and KPIs that you would expect to see in these different teams. Again, if you're looking at an innovation team, you're looking at things like product development, and you're probably measuring things like how many things did we try? What did we learn this week, right? Looking for more qualitative metrics than quantitative metrics. If you're looking at that scale team, what you're going to be looking for is growth, right? How much did we expand the market this week, this month, this quarter, what have you? How many people have we spoken to? You're looking for, again, growing and spreading within that group, right? How do we start to see traction within our intended market? And the skills that you need to do that are probably going to be around persuasion, negotiation, defining those win-wins. So you'll probably want to be focusing more on those particular skill sets. Whereas the organization at large is optimization. You're going to be looking at things like, again, that continuous improvement. You're going to really want people to stay in touch with the customer. So like one metric that we've seen works really well there is how many days since you last spoke to a customer. Again, customer doesn't have to be the person buying it. It's just somebody who is consuming your output. So making sure that they are looking at feedback, they're getting surveys, right? They're constantly taking a look at what is it that we need to deliver. How do we make sure that we are delivering at a high standard consistently over time? So that's, I think, probably the biggest difference in terms of how you manage those individual teams. It's looking at what are our objectives, what are the skills that we need in order to get there. Otherwise, it's just, good management principles, which is a broad brush, and again, a different topic. But generally speaking, it's one-on-ones, it's personal development, it's professional development, it's making sure that people have the skills and tools they need to do their jobs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And kind of, I think you and I were talking before, but as well, the sorts of skills training, you were talking about the different skill sets, and kind of what do you recommend in building out that skill set?
Yeah. First of all, hands-on whenever possible. Give people an opportunity to role play whatever it is that you want them to learn. You can also, I highly recommend doing retrospectives or postmortems. So if you have just gone into a meeting where you're trying to sell people on adopting a new process, get back together, figure out, okay, what worked, What did they seem to really engage with? What did they not? Where did they zone out and start looking at their phones? You can do a pre-mortem, which allows people to think about what it is that they're doing in advance. Like, okay, if we see these problems, what are we going to do to address them? How can we prevent them from happening in the first place? But I would be really focused, again, on that scaling team, on looking into persuasion and negotiation. It is helping them understand that it's not a win-lose scenario, it is a win-win scenario. Identifying ways to overcome objections, ways to build rapport with those individuals so that people feel like, hey, like I'm helping, we're helping to solve our problems together, as opposed to, oh, you just really need something from me. And now it's just going to be a bargain to see like the least bad that it can be. So let me just sort of take us back, if you will, to our team at Cizek. You know, I think it's really important in summary to think that if you clarify your roles and unite under a common purpose, these are things that seem very simple, but your team can literally change the course of history, right, if you do it. It took until August 6, 1945, when the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, that everyone at Cizek suddenly realized what it was they had been producing all of those years. But that's what it all came down to. They finally realized what was happening. And of course, that led to the end of the war and the surrender of Japan. So to close out, if you're thinking about how you can scale a team or implement change within your organization, I would love to connect. Always happy to talk about these topics or others. My company, NOBL, is a global change agency, and we offer organizational design, change management, and resilient leadership training. We've worked with everybody, like I said, from rapidly scaling startups to Fortune 500 companies across the globe. And we'd love to chat with you about how we can transform your business. So this is my contact information. Just a side note, if you want to learn more about the story of Cizek, then I would really recommend a book by the name of The Girls of Atomic City. It is by Denise Kiernan, and that is where I've initially discovered the information for this presentation. Don't worry, I'm not getting any kickbacks if you buy the book. So get it from your local library. I have no dog in that particular fight, but it is really interesting, and I think I hope you find it inspiring and gives you a new way to think about innovation within your own organization. So thanks so much for joining, everybody. I'll give you a little bit of time back.
Thank you so much, Paula. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Right. Great talk.
Oh, thank you so much. All right.
And we'll share the recording as well as the slides, if you'd like, on the community platform. And if you do have more questions come up after this sits for a while, feel free to engage on the community platform and we can continue the conversation there. So thanks so much again, Paula, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day or evening.
Thank you. It was great.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Jordan. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.